what we would like to see is then the governments take an approach long term of saying, actually, we do still need a high-speed rail network and an integrated transport network.
The Prime Minister says a false consensus has been accepted that links between big cities are all that matters. He reckons smaller transport projects around the country are a better use of the billions which would have been spent. We spoke earlier to the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper.
The facts have changed, so we've made a different decision. And he was very upfront about it. He said, look, there will be people that don't agree. There will be people in our own party that don't agree. But he has to make the decision that he thinks is right for the long-term interests of the country. That's leadership. And that's what he's setting out and what he showed very clearly in his speech yesterday.
Let's speak now to Tom Wadsworth. He's a board member of the High Speed Rail Group, the body representing companies with an interest in high-speed rail. Good morning to you, Tom.
Morning, Sig.
Can I put something to you? That the people responsible for running HS2 only have themselves to blame. This began as a plan with a budget of 30 billion. We heard yesterday from someone in the know that it was more likely to end up nearer to 180 billion. Nobody in their right mind would support such a load of continual overspending, and therefore this was inevitable.
I mean, clearly, we need to make sure we're getting best value for taxpayers when we're doing any big public scheme. And, I think there are, and I can understand the government's position to a certain extent on that. We at the High Speed Rail Group and our members would very much like to, look at the potential for other options. But we've got to remember that investing in big long-term infrastructure like this, like we're doing in nuclear power stations, like people would like to see in airports, things like that as well, is really important for the long-term economic growth and prosperity of the whole of the UK. And look, the government's absolutely right that we need to make sure connectivity between lots of places in our country is served well and invested in. And that was actually partly what High Speed 2 was planned with in mind, because what you're essentially talking about with new high-speed rail link is a kind of big bypass to go round some of those other towns and cities that the Prime Minister's been talking about, so that there's more capacity for them to have more services. So, obviously, we as a group, as you expect, disappointed with the decision yesterday. But what we urge the government not to do now is do anything hasty that precludes looking at this differently in the long term. Because actually there was a document out from the government yesterday that suggested they're going to sell off the land they've safeguarded. So a sort of fire sale of the land that HS2's already bought. And clearly that's a risk. I mean, it's a risk in terms of future options. And any prudent government would obviously want to keep its options open for the long term. But also it's a risk in public financing terms, because I think, I'm no land agent, but I hazard a guess that you'd make a bit of a loss on any sales of that. So we could be talking about millions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money lost by trying to sell that land off quickly, when actually we urge the government to just take a pause on that, talk to the local authorities, talk to the industry, talk to companies like our members about how else we could approach some of these issues, and then just take a pause on that.
Yeah. The point is, though, Tom, someone's screwed up somewhere, and I'd love to know who it is, and maybe it's someone in your membership group, because various people were given this task of building this damn thing. They've done it very, very slowly, and they've done it at great expense, far greater than that which was budgeted. And that's left it a sitting target for any government who points a finger at it and says, hang on a second, this is 5 times over budget. It's a disgrace. Someone has to carry the can for this, because we've all had this money wasted. As you say, it's been half started, land has been bought, people have been forcibly moved. It's now going to get changed. Labour might come in and change it again, so the mess gets bigger. Someone has got to be held accountable for why it's got to this sorry state. And who is that? Is it your members? Do your members have to put their hands up and say, you know what, we did not manage this project well?
I think that chopping and changing that you've just talked about there is part of the problem. The scheme as it is most recently proposed is very different from the original one, and we've had lots more tunnels and things like that built, so that doesn't help. And we as an industry would say that with investment schemes in general, actually, we'd like the government, governments in general should make a plan and then stick to them as they can, because every time you chop and change the scheme, you introduce costs. And we saw that recently when the government paused the work on the Euston station for HS2. Actually, that will end up costing hundreds of millions of pounds to restart because of that delay. So that builds in some cost. Clearly, we've you'll have talked endlessly about inflation anyway, so I'm not going to
Yeah.
bore people with going on about that, and that has a factor. But I think there's absolutely space then for saying, okay, we can look at future, how you would better approach future phases. But we've also got to remember that there are 30,000 people working on the existing link between London and Birmingham, and that'll create sort of 2,000 apprenticeships over the lifetime of the project as well. So there's a lot of work that's going on that will actually help the economy in that bit. What we would like to see is then the governments take an approach long term of saying, actually, we do still need a high-speed rail network and an integrated transport network. And I know you sort of mentioned some of the schemes that the government was talking about yesterday, and the industry would very much welcome the sorts of investments set out. But we got to look at this as a whole network, not a sort of either or. And actually, it might then be about timings and phasings, but actually, let's look at in the long term, what do we need as a country to get the kind of economic prosperity that both the Conservatives and Labour Party have rightly made such a priority in their pledges and missions.
And at the minute, it is either or, but then a Labour administration might regard it differently again, and we might be having a different conversation potentially, I suppose, in a year's time. Tom, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks very much.
That's Tom Wadsworth, a board member at the High Speed Rail Group.